Cool, everyone. Well, thank you very much for joining this Cryptocurrency Club live chat. We're joined here by Philipp Pieper, from the co-founder of Swarm Markets, who's going to be chatting and answering questions about DeFi and NFTs and how NFTs are expanding the DeFi ecosystem. We're going to be looking at practicalities such as regulation, cashing in and out, and tokenization, and how NFTs and DeFi are actually being used already and in the future with real world assets. So for practicalities, we try and make these live chats as interactive as possible. If you've got any questions at all at any stage, please do post any questions in the Q&A function at the bottom, so you can post any questions in there. We'll get those asked to Philipp and get those answered for you at any stage. If you want to make any other comments, we've got a chat room for that. But any questions, please do pop those in the Q&A, and at any stage we'll get those answered for you. Joined here by a few familiar faces who've been, I know, very active in the NFT space. Welcome, Magnus and co. But Philipp, thank you very much for joining us. Very excited to have you here. It'd be great if you can introduce yourself quickly.
Sure. I'm so Philipp Pieper. I've been a technology entrepreneur for around about like 15 years. In my former life before then, I actually was at Deutsche Bank doing private equity, and at Allianz doing sort of portfolio management. Found it incredibly boring to be in the financial industry at the time. And then went into technology, and little did I know that it would haunt me at the end to bring it all together. So I founded a couple of companies that I took over to Silicon Valley. I spent 10 years in Silicon Valley. I built one of the biggest data vendors in online advertising that I sold to Comscore, and then sort of, randomly stumbled into blockchain. And that was sort of in 2016. And was heavily engaged with a company called BitTorrent, which I think a couple of people might be familiar with. And then sort of reinvigorated a company called, or a project called Swarm Network, or Swarm Fund back then, which became one of the premier projects in sort of, securities, tokenization, or digital securities. There's a different number of terms for that. And we ran that as a DAO, and basically then started building, Swarm Markets on top of it, which we just announced a couple of weeks ago, but it's been like 2 years in the making, which basically is solving for liquidity in the sort of overall security space. So this has all a lot to do with, infrastructure and technology, but it also has to do with regulatory work and legal work. So trying to be as holistic as possible on this, because that's our life on blockchain these days.
Cool, no, amazing, thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, there's been so much question and talk about sort of NFTs, DeFi. I mean, we chatted just a bit earlier about sort of overview of NFTs. I think everyone, at least in the space and in the Cryptocurrency Club, will be familiar with the concept of NFTs as being digital art. And there's been a couple of questions that we answered just a little bit earlier about how else NFTs are being used, and even sort of, I mean, there's two questions where DeFi actually blends with traditional finance, but also practical use cases of NFTs, and where they're also being used in real world cases, in addition to being sold as expensive bits of digital art.
Yeah, I think NFTs is an interesting beast, because sort of this acronym, mostly meaning nothing to people, became sort of this entry gateway for a lot of people that didn't know anything about blockchain, and suddenly have this vision of something, NFT presents. And it's mainly coming through the fact that obviously there's a big group of, initial users of that technology, which is basically digital art, and maybe art in general, and sort of, the beginning of celebrities and, sort of celebrity related content that is starting to use this quite heavily. But I think, in realistic terms, first of all, like, it's been around for a long time. This is nothing technology wise new, but I think what's really striking is obviously that the dynamic around this is quite significant. So I think we've reached, $100 million in sales of NFTs, which might already be like, the last couple of days alone has been sort of, much higher. We've seen that, there's statistics out there that actually OpenSea, which is one of the biggest marketplaces, has been burning more ETH than Uniswap has, which is quite striking.
Which is a lot of ETH.
That's a lot of ETH. I think it was like 9,000 ETH a day or something like that, which is insane. And I think a lot of people have seen sort of the Beeple art being sold for, I don't know, $70 million at the time, and sort of these phenomenal stories about like GIFs and JPEGs basically being sold for, you know, millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars at least, and you know, a lot of like celebrities going into that. But so there's a bit of a head scratching when, you know, normal people just look at this because they say, okay, is this like the new craziness? But you know, or is this something where we lost touch with what the origin of actually blockchain and crypto were, and we've reduced this whole use case down to something that is as crazy as that? But I would say that I'm taking a lot more like optimistic view on this, because you know, we've seen sort of that early innings of technology waves in the space, and namely sort of DeFi was last summer something that became something big, and now it's become really a fairly well recognized and established sort of technology category in the space. It's grown into the necessity of institutions looking at it. And I think we're going to see the same thing happening in NFTs, where number one, it's bringing these additional user groups, but more importantly, it's actually something where we sort of probably have a small glimpse into the future. It's sort of a lens into how things might happen down the road. And right now it's just applied to crazy stuff, right? At least that's my opinion. But I think that alone, you know, rewards actually to take a closer look at this. And to really start to dissect what it is that NFTs represents and what it is that the future could look like to start to understand that.
And it would be good. We touched on just before we started this about some of the real world practical use cases of how NFTs are being used in diamonds and in authenticating art, for example. Could you just run through a couple of
let's maybe repeat some of that, because some of the attendees were not there yet. So Erica was mentioning that there's
chat. Sorry.
so there's Erica was mentioning that there's this technology, NFTs, has been around for a long time, and I fully agree. And there's companies previously that had done, you know, sort of authentication of diamonds or authentication of artwork, and that basically was done off-chain. So you actually take a look at the diamond and the structure of the diamond, and that results in a data set that you hash, and that hash can then be put into the NFT itself. So it resides on the blockchain with a timestamp with an owner of that. And you can then use it for provenance, basically saying, okay, well, this diamond has been authenticated here and there, and that data set is then combined with other authenticity documents. And then the ownership of that travels with the diamond. So that was the initial use case of actually building certificates on the blockchain, which nobody really realized was NFTs. And you know, if you look at the NFT market as it has evolved today, it's not too different from that, because a lot of people misunderstand that the content that these NFTs represent, whether it's, you know, the penguins or the apes or anything, the content actually resides on a server somewhere. And that server is then basically sort of connected with that NFT residing on the blockchain. The content itself doesn't necessarily reside on the blockchain. That would not be feasible, right? So in the end, this is nothing different from the application perspective than when you do real world assets in the widest sense of what it represents. So if it's a video file, if it's a JPEG, if it's a collectible in a game, if it's a music piece, that data resides somewhere and is being pointed to by the NFT. Mm-hmm. Now, if you then think that the NFT can represent, I don't know, a license revenue stream from a music piece, or a real estate, or a tracking ID of a package, all that is the same kind of, you know, context, technology-wise, application-wise, and all the problems that go with it. So the issues that you need to resolve there is how to make sure that the NFT is really connected with that piece of real, you know, file or real world asset. So there's some legal considerations to be done there. There's actually sort of a, you know, an infrastructure question. How do you tie the blockchain infrastructure with the real asset? There's a question around veracity of data. So how do you make sure that the data is represented in the correct shape and form, and may actually also morph over time. Maybe there's secondary attestations that are necessary to really represent that it is what it is. And then you can do a lot of things in the aftermath. So once something's digitized as a unique piece of value that way, it's basically creating a digital twin of the real thing. And that digital twin becomes a building block in doing all sorts of other things. So in the end, DeFi's or NFTs are going to tie into DeFi, because once they are actually sort of digitized, there's a lot of programmability that can happen along the way with it.
No, great, thank you. And I mean, again, we touched on this slightly earlier, just before we sort of started. But one of the things about NFTs is when you look at the different platforms, it's still not easy. I mean, if people have been in the crypto space for ages and are familiar with having an Ethereum wallet and know how to send crypto transactions, that's one thing. But for the vast majority of people looking at NFTs, it's not an easy experience. You've got to have a MetaMask or a crypto wallet. In most cases, most NFT platforms don't yet have the facility to be able to take payments by credit card or with fiat and so forth, and even what to do with your NFT. And that's a question I get asked really often. Will the user experience get easier? Will it be soon possible to buy NFTs just like any other art sort of on marketplaces? And what about storing them? How are they stored? Can they be stored securely? If you're spending 69 million buying an NFT, can that get stolen? Can it be copied? Could you touch on some of the practicalities and ease of use and user experience, and where you see that going?
Yeah, so we've obviously come a long way since 2-3 years ago, when the use cases that we were talking about, that obviously was not usable from a consumer perspective. But let's maybe to look at these two groups of users that interact with NFTs. One is actually the issuer of an NFT, so the originator of the piece of art or something that basically for the first time creates that digital twin and then goes to the blockchain in the widest sense of the world. So it could be on Ethereum, it could be through a sort of interface on someone like OpenSea or someone like Rarible, and then basically says, I have the idea to connect whatever I've created or the thing that is valued by a user, and connect that on the blockchain with something called an NFT. That probably is, it's come a long way, but it's still too complicated, right? It's it's not that difficult, but if you're not familiar with what a wallet is and you don't know what MetaMask is, it's incredibly hard, right? Because you still have that initial friction point of actually getting into this infrastructure before you can do anything of that sort. So we have, number one, we have educational challenges, but like you say, ideally at some point in time, you actually have something where you don't need to know about what a wallet is. You may want to recognize it in the end, but actually the function, needs to be sort of blended into a platform and maybe beyond, and maybe make it transportable to be able to use that. So it's still something that has challenges, and the ones that actually do it today, they obviously are people that have been around the space or are using service providers that have been around the space to create these things. The second user group, as you refer to, is basically the ones that buy these items, these unique items. And yes, that's still a group of people that also are educated on this front. The reason why a lot of these things are still as complicated as they are not just because the platforms think in terms of inside baseball and they assume that everyone should know this, but it's also because they have a lot of limitations. So if you think of wallets being sort of connected with a login, with an email login, which everyone's used to when they use Facebook or anything, that has some repercussions from a legal perspective. So you're hosting other people's keys. If you're doing that, you're taking the responsibility of the value that you're holding on behalf of the user, which very, very quickly gets into regulatory questions of custodianship and legalities around it. So by stripping that away from a complexity perspective, the platforms are reducing it down to the core use case and making sure that they don't overstep boundaries at this point in time that they're not supposed to overstep, because it can quickly become very complicated, whatever that NFT represents. So I would say a lot of things don't meet the eye. They're not that obvious. But yes, we should come to a state, and that can be sooner than later, that basically you, number one, as a buyer, you have simplicity to get in. You have a way to actually sort of, pay with your credit card or sort of with fiat. You have a way to not have to know the sort of inside tools being used by the crypto community. And most importantly, if you spend that amount of money, that you have the security that you're actually buying something that really belongs to you. Because, and maybe that's something that is most not obvious to people today, is that if you buy a piece of artwork today, it resides on a server. And try to find the terms of use that really qualify how that commitment of that server being operated by someone is to represent that content that you're buying for an insane amount of money in perpetuity, because you're assuming that you're doing it on perpetuity, right? But if that server gets shut down, that content is lost, and you've actually you don't have anything in your hand. You have the authenticity that you own it, but you don't actually have access to it. Yeah. So there's a lot of double clicking that is going to happen, that is going to make this all sort of more solid. There's people working on integrated infrastructure where the blockchain is integrated into content delivery networks, which is going to be a big deal. But also just from a legal side, it's gonna have to go through a couple of iterations to make it as secure and reliable and trustworthy as it should be.
No, cool, thank you. You've got a few questions there about sort of playifying. Greg Kerr is asking about playifying the Kimberley process and earning NFTs and sort of reputation for complying with the Kimberley process, which I must confess I just Googled as a process for authenticating diamonds and avoiding conflict diamonds in the diamond supply chain. And there is a project, the one that we were speaking about earlier, it's called Tracer, that's TRACR, which is the one that was set up by the De Beers Diamond Company initially, and I think is now independent, but they were looking at doing that, sort of having the digital certificates for diamonds and scanning diamonds to have as NFTs, whereby the certificate is not so much holding the value of the diamond like the digital art would be, but is rather a sort of a proof of certificate for a representation of the diamond. One question for you from Mohammed, Philip, he's asking about what makes NFTs intrinsic value go so high, and as they don't hold any actual use case. I mean, one short answer is that not all NFTs are worth a lot. There's some that don't sell, there's some that sell for a few dollars, which isn't much more than the cost of minting them, but there are some that really are going high. And are people buying these as is it a fun, is it a sort of a status thing, is it a belief that they'll go up in value? Could you touch on that a little bit?
Well, that would imply that I really can look into the heads of people that basically have this kind of motivation. I think when it started off becoming really sort of a materially interesting space, which was basically sort of in Q1 of this year, I would say the newness of what that represented was just like mind blowing. So if you look at Christie's as a reputable art auction house, actually sort of going and actually auctioning off people's everyday's artwork, that's a big statement. That's a new thing where digital art for the first time, and that credibility with that reputation was actually brought in that kind of sales process, right? So that is certainly a landmark of justifying. I'm not saying justifying, but possibly sort of pointing in that direction, that actually just as a statement, as a milestone in the art world, was justifying a high price. Whether it's that high price or something else, I can't tell you, right? But I think what we've seen actually sort of happening as a result of that is that you see a lot of speculation. So just because high prices are being paid for a single piece of art, at that point in time, they've already gone through a number of hands. My personal interpretation of what's going on right now is that there's just a lot of funny money that is being thrown around on this new use case, and the use case is actually something fun to be around. So I'm not discarding that this value is in the eye of the beholder. So if someone actually buys an ape with a, a mohawk, that probably means something to that person spending that money. And it's not just speculation, right? Because they assume that the next one in this game is going to pay a higher price, or they value it holding in a long time because it represents this kind of uniqueness, right? But that might hold, or it might just fade out again. That's a different question. I would say that the use case being battle-proof in the way, it's actually pointing in a lot more like content that under objective perspectives we would say is valuable coming into this space and using the same tools as we have them. So you saw this with NBA Top Shots, where suddenly content that is connected with celebrities became something that became tradable. And that moment of Steph Curry at the Warriors doing a certain dunk, it means something to the fan holding it, right? And that will extend into other asset classes as well, right? But I think we should avoid trying to always think in terms of like, is this right or wrong? But maybe think in terms of, okay, what does this represent in terms of new interaction, and how do we like observe how these user groups value things differently? I mean, not everyone can relate to in-game kind of activity, in-game virtual goods, etc., but they have become a huge market. And so virtual goods themselves are going to be an astoundingly high value market for the NFT space once they become interoperable amongst the gaming space.
Oh, great. And that touches onto a question about the sort of the NFT marketplaces that it's one we touched on super briefly earlier, but currently you've got a few of the main sort of platforms and main marketplaces. OpenSea you mentioned is one of them, and the user experience at the moment it's not as easy as it could be, and maybe will become easier as and when they sort of integrate with fiat on and off ramps. But one question that I'm often asked by the community, and I think it's where things are potentially going, you hear talk about, well, we're going to build our own NFT marketplace. People don't want to just sell on an existing one. They want to have their own marketplace for their own art, or for tokenization of real estate, or for this asset or the other asset. And I mean that it's an interesting question. It's the same as is it better to have your own shop, or is it better to sell on Amazon in by way of similarity, but not really? Is that something that you'd be able to touch on Philipp, about sort of the different marketplaces, and about, I think, what realistically might happen, and the benefits of having a specific own marketplace for real estate that's being tokenized and traded as such, or for diamonds that are being traded as such, or for artwork, or for a charity that's wanting to launch NFTs to raise sponsorship, for example.
So I'll just repeat it a little bit, some of the stuff that I said initially. I think the act of digitizing something, is a huge liberation, because it suddenly becomes, theoretically and practically becomes, a programmable entity. So there's a lot of things you can do with it. You can do an auction process, you can lend against it or borrow against it, you can potentially fractionalize it, right? So if someone buying the Beeple portfolio, which should not be segmented, but it's meant to be 1,000 or 5,000 days of artwork pieced together as a bundle, well, maybe people want a small piece of that, right? And suddenly becomes very quickly things that aren't really possible in the real world, then suddenly become possible in the digitized world, using DeFi mechanisms, doing programmable ways to collateralize, and I think it's hard to overstate what that liberation looks like, because suddenly there's something on the other end that is not just mimicking what the real world is doing, but it's actually doing something in a different fashion, right? When specifically, I know a little bit or a lot about sort of the creative landscape, because I built a company called Loop Media, or I co-founded it, which became a public company in the United States, where we have the biggest library of music videos and movie trailers on the web. And it's basically one of the key processes in the creative landscape is that a lot of the past was done by gatekeeping, and the gatekeepers had a huge function to fulfill, whether it's the studios or the the labels. They have a making function where they build franchises around artists, and they have distribution channels, and they have production abilities, etc. And that has a real reason to exist. But the problem is that the artists themselves are not able to bypass that. They're not able, if they choose to go direct, they have a hard time to find the same kind of distribution. They have a hard time to find the visibility of what their creative piece actually has done in the landscape, whether in terms of views, listens, or whatever. So I think from an artist perspective, and that was the big promise that I think most of the art world saw when actually this the NFT topic came up beginning of the year, is somehow, number one, to reclaim some of that control, to reclaim some of the ability to build and share revenue streams, and therefore have a different way to finance whatever the creative process actually costs. But number two, also to actually have that transparency on an ongoing basis of what this piece of art has in terms of impact and meaning to people and consumption. And it's overstated a little bit as the savior of an industry that is that way. But I do believe that there's a lot of contributions that technology like NFT technology can actually bring to that process. And I think we're going to be surprised by people then having huge success doing that directly, or finding some product market fit for what they have with the technology, with the consumer on the other end. So I think there's a lot of consumer groups, like I said, that are beyond the crypto insides, that are basically ready to transact that way, that pay a lot of money to get NFT tickets for the concert that they want to hear by their artists. Mm-hmm. And that suddenly becomes a platform that is very, very scalable if you actually commoditize that and make that usable and consumable for the user, like you were referring to, Erica.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, we've touched on this a little bit already, but it'd be good if you just go a bit more in depth. And it's another question that everyone asks, and Mohammed's saying this is the right time to invest in NFTs, and looking at security, safety, storage, along with the user experience. And so we're not talking, I think, from Howard's question, and sort of to clarify, we're not talking about the investment potential, i.e. will it go up or down in value. I wouldn't even want to go close to that question, and that's obviously highly speculative, but on a practical stance, how far are we away from insurance companies in insuring a piece of digital art or an NFT, or it's obviously with the rise of cybercrime, is that a threat, or where are we at regarding that? I mean, this is sort of off.
But there's like three questions in the same question, so let's maybe dissect that a little bit. Like okay, so first of all, no financial advice. Let's just be clear on that. This isn't
about the will NFTs go up or down in value.
Exactly. So, I would be, if I'm spending that kind of money, or whatever kind of price on actually trying to purchase something, do your own research. But to me, it matters that I know that I have what I'm buying, and have what I'm buying, meaning that I know from the terms of someone promising me something, that I do have access to what that ownership, certificate means. In this case, it's an NFT that certifies that I own that piece of video. So I would be looking at the terms, saying, okay, what does this ensure me? Is this giving me real ownership rights and IP rights to the video? Is it really giving me something that I can resell, because that's part of the value as well? Does it give me something as a secondary revenue stream? And what's the solidity of that promise? Is that something that would require a regulatory founding or not? Because if you promise revenue streams, you probably have to make a proper public offering, right? And a lot of people also don't understand that really, right? So that matters, and I think we're obviously light years away from the rudimentary procedures that we had 2017 or 16 in the blockchain space. But NFTs have, maybe faster, but have a lot of that to go through as well at this point in time, because there are issues around this that exist. Secondly, I would say, ask yourself, what motivation do you have to do it, right? Is it that you want to buy a piece of digital art to present it on your digital screen at home? Or is it something that you buy for speculative reasons, and you know enough about the markets, and you know enough about the tools being used in the markets, and you know about the marketplaces that they don't misrepresent what they really are to possibly lose whatever you have, right? So in that act of even trading or transferring the ownership, there's some pitfalls there, but I think there's good explainers that can actually give you comfort there. And then you just have to ask your own question of actually sort of how much is what you want to put at risk there, and is it really worthwhile what you do there? Maybe the last piece of the question that I was sort of hearing from you is, okay, so there's the questions around, okay, technology always has two sides to it, right? The picture perfect side, and then there's the dark side, where a lot of people want to point to the dark side a lot and saying, well, you can misuse this, and sort of, that's something that then sort of restricts what the entire technology should be doing. So of course you can use NFTs to represent content that is nefarious, that is violating certain rights, and that is prohibited. So
we've heard cases of that. I mean, just to touch on that, of a conversation with the police, and they're seeing or hearing cases of things like revenge porn, or you steal your ID, or you
child
steal
porn,
or you get your bank details, or you get your private information, and you sell that as an NFT, and then either extort money out of you or sell it to the highest bidder, and then can that be taken down?
Well, and that's where sort of the marketplace structure as it exists today comes into play, right? Because on one hand, people don't realize it, but these centralized players, these centralized marketplaces, that do the issuance, they sort of are in control of the content that is residing on their servers, which means that they also have the obligation to do the curation and the filtering, and in the end also to know who's acting on their servers, right? So there is an obligation, which a lot of those marketplaces don't yet really fulfill, is to actually sort of know who the actors are, that if something bad happens, that basically there's a way to get repercussions in place, right? But that said, I think so far that's a pretty contained issue. It becomes always a further issue when there's more decentralization, when there's more permissionless things in place.
Yeah.
And then it's a question of actually building trust infrastructure that the community can help peer-to-peer review and make sure that it's it is excluded from monetary flows, right? And that's where sort of regulated marketplaces come into play, because in the end, that is what a lot of not just financial market regulators but other regulators are really concerned around. And so I think we do live in a world where that has become clear to regulators, and they're moving in and they're taking action. So we just have to make sure as a community that we build technology that preserves all the creativity and the self-sufficiency and the sort of the self-determination that a user has with technology, while being able to sort of still abide by the rules that are set, right? More complicated answer beyond that, but I think that goes too far if we actually start down that path.
Sure, thank you. So one subject which is sort of spanning DeFi and NFTs a little bit, and I've had a few questions and a few conversations, and I know there's a number of startups and so forth looking at this space, is going back to the tokenization of real world assets and making real world assets more liquid. So just as an example, there's a number of startups now looking at this space, and they're all not quite at the stage of having completed what they're doing yet. So at the moment, it's still a hypothetical scenario, but take investment in real estate, for example. The number of people that could buy a flat or a piece of commercial real estate, it's limited. Whereas if you break that real estate into chunks and you sell 1,000 pieces of this real estate for $1,000 each, or or $10 each, or $100 each, whatever that is, there's a scenario where people could buy 1 meter square of this piece of real estate, or buy 1% of this piece of real estate, and then and own that, and potentially make that more liquid and trade that. And again, as the conversations this stage are relatively hypothetical because we're yet to having that in practice. But how far, I mean, how far do you see that from being a reality where people can buy 1 meter square of this flat and then you store it in your wallet, and then you send that to you in a different country, or you pay for this, or you trade this for this, and so forth, instead of using fiat currency? Is that realistic? Do you see that happening? Is the infrastructure in place yet? And also, I mean, to do with regulation and so forth. Have you any thoughts about that? Because it's one of the questions that's hot on everybody's list. Like, is it practical to buy 1 meter square of a piece of real estate? Is it practical to buy 1% of a famous painting, or 1% of a diamond, or whatever that is?
Yeah, and that's where the answer becomes a little more nuanced, because I think I'm going to choose a different example for one reason. If you choose real estate is a value, much like, by the way, a music piece as well, that it in the end has subsequent cash flows that go through it. And the question is sort of, what if that piece of real estate is being rented to someone? Mm-hmm. The rental income, how is that distributed? So in this case,
it needs maintenance, or
exactly. So all the processes that have to do with cash and subsequent value flows. It's not just about the ownership of that piece of real estate, so that 1 square meter of the real estate, because it's incredibly difficult from a financial market regulatory perspective, right? Or let's put it this way, it doesn't become difficult. It's very clear that you need certain regulatory methods to actually be able to do that, right? But let's say, for simplistic reasons, let's take a classic car. Let's take like a Ferrari from the 1960s that basically gets driven into a secure location of a garage. Mm-hmm. That is then held there by a custodian that basically makes sure that is always there. And then the owner of that car then takes the ownership certificates, and with a legal binding agreement, connects the ownership of that with an NFT. That's a very real use case. And it's not just limited to cars, but anything that basically doesn't have a lot of cash flows associated with it. You can do it. Carbon certificates is the same example, right? But in the end, sorry, I was getting a call. In the end, once that legal binding connection is made, the digital twin can then actually travel to other places. It can actually be, if there's a market valuation for it, then it can actually be borrowed against it, or you can bundle it together with other classic cars, and you can actually, fractionalize that bundle, or you can fractionalize the car itself, like you're saying, right? That too is a regulatory activity, and that's one of the reasons why we sort of started building Swarm Markets as the first regulated DeFi protocol, because a lot of these use cases require someone to abide by the rules of being able and being licensed to build a market like I was describing, right? So, but we're not that far away. It sounds crazy, but there's behind the scenes, there's been a lot of heavy lifting being done in the last 18 months on getting confidence around how does a regulator look at this, how are the tools solidified. I myself have been working on tokenization use cases since 2016. So from a technology and from a deployment perspective, we've gotten in orders of magnitude simpler, and it's almost commoditized at this point in time. But it's about putting these pieces together and now deploying them to new use cases. And that's why it's so exciting to see sort of the NFT use cases take their shape and form as they did during this year, because suddenly there's an attention to the fact that something is being digitized and then being put into a market context. That is incredibly exciting, and that will be applied to other assets the same shape and form as it's been done to digital art at this point.
Cool. No, thank you for that. I mean, one question, sort of going back to you on sort of the DeFi side, and it'd be good to hear sort of all the Swarm Markets view on this, as well as your personal view. But another question I'm always asked is, where does DeFi get into traditional finance? And I guess my sort of personal experience of this, just from the Crypto Curry Club, is almost every day I get an email or a call or something from somebody who's from traditional finance or from, traditional, from banking or from defense or from retail or from a sort of totally non-crypto, non-DeFi industry, getting a job in a crypto or DeFi startup, wanting to work in the space because they're more interested or because it's moving super fast. And on the same side, we're seeing moves the other way, whereby people with crypto or DeFi experience are now being hired by some of the more traditional banks, and there's more and more job openings for those people. So what I'm, even personally seeing is that there's quite a big crossover now happening with people moving from traditional finance into the crypto and DeFi startups and bringing with them all of their experience and their contact bases, which is opening up a lot of the crypto and DeFi startups to sort of the contact bases and networks of traditional finance and vice versa. And, I'm seeing that happening more and more and more. And, that I'm seeing more and more conversations happening between sort of startups, the DeFi startups and traditional finance. And, at the moment, that's just people who are getting to know each other and conversations happening. But it'd be interesting to get your view on that, on where do you see sort of DeFi blending in with traditional finance and how realistic. I mean, you've got sort of jumping to the DeFi space here, but you've got, things I would consider to be scary at best, things like lending and borrowing against crypto, and you've got staking in some of these new terms. How realistic is it that these things will become mainstream and will be used by traditional finance? Is that just the sort of the space of the DeFi startups that are willing to take relatively higher risks, or where do you see that going?
Yeah, so coming back to what I initially said, I think like to draw the comparison to NFTs. Right now, we're in this crazy market of NFTs representing things that people may or may not be able to relate to, but it's a lens into the future, what's going to happen in the next 12 to 24 months. And we had a similar situation last year with DeFi, which suddenly, it was around before then, like NFTs has been around before then. So, only because second quarter of last year, it started to really explode. Concepts that represented DeFi maybe weren't coined DeFi, existed like 12 to 24 months before then already. But what happened was, and this was applied to, and that's why crypto and DeFi had a big Venn diagram overlap and still have, right? They were applied to sort of, get rid of issues or address issues that existed with centralized exchanges, that addressed issues with, with lending and borrowing, but they came up with new concepts. And so maybe just to repeat what DeFi is in the end, to me at least, DeFi are basically fungible tokens, while NFTs are non-fungible tokens, and DeFi are smart contract-based methods to replicate, financial market infrastructure in some shape and form. And the characteristics going into that are that they're based on so-called self-custody. So me as an individual or as an institution, I go with my own wallet infrastructure into this, and I make my own decisions. And making my own decisions means also that I can just look on the other end, what am I using in terms of smart contract? And theoretically, if you can read code, you can actually just, transparently figure out what you're getting yourself into. And, basically it's a very self-determined way actually to deal with financial market infrastructure. The second piece is the transparency leads also to, I would say, networked participation. And if you look at exchanges, and Uniswap being sort of the biggest one there, network liquidity is a big deal, which means this is very different than traditional market infrastructure, where people can come together and it's basically like mini DAOs on these pools, and they can just throw their capital, their crypto assets into pools where they think the market is going to be most attractive and make money off of the trading fees that actually are occurring in that pool. That concept didn't exist in the traditional finance space, where, in this case, the asset owners themselves can make money off of creating a market for their own assets. And the same applies to lending and borrowing. The same applies to other use cases, right? So what happened in the last 12 months is that these new concepts, and these are not just replications of traditional finance, but it's technology-enabled innovations. They came to build something else. They came to build something that is truly novel when it comes to compare it to traditional markets. And I think while ridiculed at the beginning by traditional finance, this transition has happened earlier this year, maybe late of last year, where the volumes became so big that it was hard to ignore what it represented and how much appeal it had. And so when we started to sort of, with Swarm Markets move into the regulatory side and actually sort of double click on actually building protocol infrastructure that addresses some of the issues that institutional investors have to engage in the space, it became clear that the tone and the attitude had completely changed how institutions look at the space. There's a sense of inevitability that this is going to represent a next version of some kind of financial market infrastructure. And maybe historically speaking, maybe a lot of people don't know this, but there was in the beginning of the 90s, there was a technology in the financial market infrastructure called the FIX protocol, which is basically a sort of a compatibility protocol amongst the exchanges, where they suddenly were able to, talk to each other based on data definitions, right? And in some ways, we're doing that in DeFi on steroids, because it's not just an exchange protocol, but it's actually something where suddenly there's a transparency that is orders of magnitude higher than in the traditional finance markets, which I think a lot of regulators are very surprised by, that you can suddenly program this on a mutual platform. And today, banks don't have that. They don't have a mutual programming platform to program financial instruments. And I think that's the appeal for a lot of people moving into this space. It's not just the novelty and sort of the dynamic that is happening, but it's also that they're seeing that the inhibitants and the restrictions of existing financial market infrastructure are blowing wide open with these new mechanisms. It's still going to take some time to really get into the same volumes that the financial market have, but even a smaller amount of actually, assets and procedures moving over will have a phenomenal effect there.
No, thank you. Greg is asking, is DeFi super risky, or is it the best stewardship of money, or both? I mean, I don't think that's a black and white question, unfortunately. I think
the answer is
if
yes.
anything, there's DeFi platforms and DeFi platforms, but
yeah, I think the answer is yes to both, right? So DeFi is super risky if you right now, if you're engaging and you don't understand what you're getting yourself into, meaning that you don't understand the tools, you don't understand the infrastructure, the layer 2 and layer 1 infrastructure, and basically also don't understand how to assess, who are you transacting with. So only because it's a smart contract, by the way, there's still requirements for institutions, for example, that they know their counterparties, that they know who they're dealing with on the other side, right? So while we are still in this early phase of the technology, there obviously have been challenges when it comes to complexity, and a lot of interactions, technology interactions of smart contracts amongst each other were often the reason that there were these, DeFi hacks and the disappearance of funds. But it goes beyond that, we're coming to, projects that have proven track records of actually being solid, I wouldn't say unhackable, but at least that they haven't,
doing what they can to check and to work with lawyers and so forth. Yeah,
correct. So and the procedures are also valid proven. So for example, you don't have to reinvent the wheel to then put modular pieces together for liquidity or lending and stuff like that. There's proven models that still are innovated along the way to then do that. But yes, it is very risky if you don't know what you're doing. But that's the job of organizations like us to simplify that, to make choices on your behalf, but also be addressable, right? So I think a lot of the issues in DeFi were that the organizations themselves weren't really visible and out there and identifiable and didn't have regulatory foundation. Then it's really hard in the end to, if something goes wrong, to actually look at that organization. And like you were saying, Erica, I mean, the best proof is if insurance comes in, because insurance won't do a insurance deal with something that is nebulous and not really identifiable.
not too often. And it isn't a black and white question. I mean, just if you sort of expand onto sort of DeFi instance of the crypto space, if you look at people say in Venezuela, just going slightly off piece, you've got they're one of the highest users of Bitcoin and crypto, not because crypto isn't volatile or because it may or may not go up in value, but to people there where you've got hyperinflation and you've got thousands of % of inflation, and you get paid 1 month and that's basically eroded by the next, so that you can't eat because it's because of the economic situation, that you've got people getting into the crypto space there because they see it as safer. And then the other risk of with crypto, I mean, like, it's not a question of you get hacked or you send your money to a scam or whatever, and you can call your bank and go, hey, I'm really sorry, I got my money hacked. Once you send a transaction, you've sent that transaction. So if you send that transaction to a scam or to a bad wallet or whatever, you can't just call up someone and go, hey, sorry, I did this, can you send my money back?
The outer rims of financial ecosystem. So if you go to like the unbanked areas, I think we all are striving to solve something for that audience and actually bring them things that they don't have access to today. But I think the core volume driver today is still within the industrial nations within this financial market. And it's very simple to understand what basically the value here is, right? Because if you go to the traditional financial ecosystem and just an exchange, if you visualize that, you as an individual have to go to a bank that works with a brokerage entity. That brokerage entity has to work with an exchange. That exchange works with a central custodian infrastructure. Each one of those chains, and that the same from the buyer side, has to be regulatory vetted. It has to be sort of running their own infrastructure. It has to make their own money. So it stacks up quite significantly, and that collapses all into a single source of truth. That actually this instant settlement that the blockchain presents, doesn't need those replications amongst 10 different parties in that one equation. So that in itself just it's very simplified, but it becomes obvious that collapsing the stack has to lead to economies that benefit the seller and the buyer, and it actually collapses what happens in between.
So short answer, DeFi is not risk-free. Quick one from Ivan touching on insurance, about these use cases of decentralized insurance, using pooling to provide insurance to those who want to protect their crypto assets. And can you talk on whether you see this getting larger or even blending into traditional insurance?
So for everyone's benefit, so there's different players out there that basically do pool and smart contract driven sort of insurance to safeguard your trading in crypto, against drops or in the end rises. So basically there's a way to pay a premium to a pool that ensures that you don't lose your assets, and you basically sort of can make sure that the volatility in the market doesn't kill you from different aspects. Kill you, I mean liquidate you from the monetary perspective. Very interesting concepts, I think, very early on in the market, but they're gaining traction. And that also is a lens to maybe more insurance products. So having worked for one of the biggest insurance companies globally called Allianz Group, I just know capital pools are basically so far institutional capital pools. So before they actually move on chain to do the same, and peer-to-peer insurance can do the same, there's a lot that needs to happen. But it's a first very interesting use case that comes in here. And I do believe that, it's specific to crypto to insure it there. It becomes more complicated when insurance represents off-chain events. So if you basically have, theft insurance, right? How do you make sure that that event is really what it was, and, what the claim is? And
how do you know it was a theft and not you sending it to, right?
Yeah, so I'm a little less optimistic when it comes to the entire insurance use case, or insurances moving on chain. But for the specific use case of actually sort of, volatility risk reduction, it's a pretty good and interesting first use case.
Cool. No, and there's one last question from Sai, who's posted it twice. We'll get on this before we let you go. Philipp, how will NFTs impact the music aggregators? Could it cause disintermediation of the music industry in the future? such as removal of aggregators such as DistroKid, CD Baby, etc. Now, I must confess, I've never heard of either DistroKid or CD Baby, and know a
I know the
grand total
founder,
of nothing about music aggregators. So over to
No,
you.
I know the founder, Phil Kaplan, who built DistroKid. But so it's the same answer as with banks. So you can ask the question like, will banks exist in 15 years, right? And the same, same question you can ask about, labels or movie studios, et cetera. It's like, it's not a yes or no answer. It's more, how will they exist and which ones will exist? And it's what technology does in this case, whether it's NFTs or DeFi or whatever, it allows the end consumer to have much higher degree of optionality, much better economics, and therefore choice. So if an organization understands to become, consumer focused, and that consumer could be the buyer and the consumer on the, listening to a music piece, or it could be the consumer of actually sort of producing content. If there's something that they do that is not technology automated and that is, still needs their capabilities, maybe aggregation capabilities, they have a reason to exist. And a lot of the big artists that are out there, they really benefit from the power of labels being able to produce a Taylor Swift and everything that goes with it, with that, world of not just concerts and music, but everything that surrounds a artist that Taylor Swift represents, right? So I think it will make it more interesting for sure, because a lot of people will try to cling on to that middleman position and just try to defend it as long as they can. And we've seen that movie before, literally in the movie space. But the nice thing here is that actually we're adding a sort of technology to make that more interesting and empower both the consumer and the producer of content. And really just a lot of things might happen along the way. So I think the organizations will look very differently, but it will still be around. I don't doubt that.
Cool, amazing. Well, conscious of time, and Philippe, thank you so much for all of that. Thank you to everyone who joined and for all of your questions. Philippe, have you got any last points or comments about Swarm, or any last words? Other than thank you very much for joining us, but have you got any parting?
No, I think I do a lot of education where I think it's important for either crypto insiders or not to start trialing things. And it's hard to explain what DeFi is. It's hard to explain what NFTs are if you've never used them before. So the most important thing is to get yourself interact, play at the risk of possibly losing everything, but it's quite quite a difference in experience if you suddenly know that you're actually staking liquidity in a liquidity pool in something that is secure, but you're seeing suddenly month per month or day by day you see your rewards come in, and that is something immediate, and you're making your own decisions. And that's something also that I think we need to relearn. I think a lot of society has learned to trust other organizations making the decision for themselves. And it's about actually reclaiming part of that, also the responsibility that comes with it. So I think we're coming to an era where that is going to become far automated, much more simple than it is today, but it's going to be something that is really empowering rather than what we have a lot of times today. And
I mean, you say play and risk losing everything, but it doesn't have to be about that. And I wouldn't say it should be about that. I mean, you can if $20 is a non-event for you, you can sort of just get involved and see how things are without risking anything. I mean, one sort of parting comment I would make, and I imagine you've seen the same, Philip, it's a space where I see things changing so fast, and there's such a brain drain of super smart people moving into work in the space, and things are changing and evolving so fast that I have no doubt that by this time next year we'd be having an entirely different conversation about where DeFi is at, or where NFTs are at, or where user experience in crypto is at.
Yeah, I mean, there's this famous words by Ben Horowitz. Software is eating the world. Finance has not undergone that yet, as much as people want to believe it. But basically, sort of, finance has been pretty much in a very similar state for 20 years, right? And so we're just in a very rapid pace seeing that being chipped away at, and sort of in the end, whatever can be automated, can be dematerialized, will be dematerialized.
And which has been accelerated by Corona.
It's the Kodak moment for the financial market industry, right? So where, Kodak, this behemoth in the photo space, and suddenly there was Instagram. It's the same story, or AT&T with with WhatsApp suddenly, right? I think like, as an entrepreneur, I feel empowered like never before, because these tools and whatever we can do with these tools are so incredibly powerful, but we also have to do it responsibly. But it's I think, you no longer need to, build servers. You don't even need to operate a system, right? Because it's all on the decentralized, infrastructure in that point in time. And, it's very much transparent, and in a way where you don't necessarily have to have the centralization take place. In certain instances you do, but it's really empowering if you understand what that means.
Cool. No, well, thank you so much, Philipp. Thank you to everyone for the questions, and hopefully see you all soon.
Fantastic.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Philipp. Take care.
Take care.